So, good afternoon. Looks like it's about 1 o'clock, so let's get started. My name is Eric Porterfield, and with me today are Jennifer Wondracek and Beth Donahue. We are going to be talking about several things. We're going to be talking about learning outcomes. We're going to be talking about assessments, and specifically multiple assessments, using lots of them. I am going to start off by giving you just a little bit of history. I'm with the UNT Dallas College of Law. We are a very new law school. We just completed our first academic year. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history about how we came to be involved in the learning outcome and assessment business, and what we're doing to try and both do it right and to make sure we meet both the spirit and the letter of the new ABA standards. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about that. I'm going to talk at sort of a 30,000 foot level of how we're actually implementing the idea of using multiple assessments. Then I'll turn it over to Jennifer, and she will give you a much more detailed idea of how we actually implement using learning outcomes, using multiple assessments, how we track that data, how we use that data. And then you'll hear from Beth Donahue, and you'll hear about the pedagogical value of having multiple assessments. And you'll hear things like, multiple choice questions. Gosh, isn't this law school? Aren't we talking about law school, and isn't it just one, final essay exam? Well, no. There's actually lots of ways to assess student learning, and some of them are better for some purposes than others. And in fact, you can be taught how to write a multiple choice question. I am living proof of that. Beth Donahue taught me how to write a multiple choice question. I'm almost good.
He's very good.
So, without further ado, let me tell you just a little bit about us. So, we are brand new. As I said, we were a long-held idea, probably going back to the 70s. But we actually, you can see the enabling legislation, went and found it. Actually, I didn't find it. I had to get a librarian to find it. So the librarian actually found the copy signed by the governor to prove that we exist. So we were formally formed, if that's an appropriate phrase, in 2009. We had our first entering class in the fall of 2014. So we had the opportunity. The timing for us was actually really good. A lot of people would say, why in the world would you open a law school right now? I mean, seriously, why now? It's the perfect time. It's because we get to build it from the ground up, and we get to choose for ourselves the right way to do it, informed by a bunch of information that's already been out there. You probably have all heard of things like the McCrae report and the Carnegie report, but really the drivers of why we use learning outcomes, why we use multiple assessments, for a couple of folks that really should be standing here talking, Judge Ferguson and our Associate Dean, Ellen Pryor. These are the folks who really carried the water and are the ones who said, we are going to do it this way. So our entire school, as a faculty, even before I joined, and I was there for the inaugural faculty, the entire faculty has signed on to this as an idea. We are all going to do it. We are all going to use learning outcomes. We are all going to use multiple assessments. And multiple doesn't mean two. Multiple means more than two. Multiple means a lot. So a lot of assessments, frequent assessments. And we really have Ellen and the judge to thank for that, because we're hardly the first to say that legal education is broken, it needs reform. Many of the critiques are beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, things like cost. But a lot of the things, a lot of these critiques that you could have said in 1970 are still valid today. That one final exam that is your entire grade, the fact that you don't get much practical training. Well, believe it or not, all of this multiple assessment stuff helps with both of those. The multiple assessments are much more valid and reliable, and they actually tie into practical training. Stay tuned for that. We're going to talk about that, more about that in just a few minutes. So, this is not the driver, at least not the initial driver, but it's certainly something we have to be aware of, right? If you're going to be a law school, you got to be accredited by these folks. If you want to operate a law school in this country, the ABA gets to give you the stamp of approval or take it away. So, right after we had opened our doors for business, the ABA adopted some new standards. So you are probably familiar with those, so I'm not going to just read all of this text. I just want to highlight a few things. So, 302, Revised Standard 302. So, many of you have probably already read this before, but the big difference is the part highlighted in red. Why should all law schools care about learning outcomes? Because the ABA says thou shalt. Learning outcomes. 302 used to measure inputs. 302 used to say thou shalt provide substantial instruction in yada 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 yada. But now the ABA has said you have to actually measure learning outcomes. It's about outcomes, not inputs. Maybe it doesn't seem like a sea change, but it really is. Okay. What else do you have to do? If you're going to use learning outcomes, well, you've got to actually use assessments to see if you're meeting those learning outcomes. And Standard 314 now says that you've got to use both formative and summative assessment methods in your curriculum. Now, if you look at the comments following 314, sure, it doesn't say you have to use multiple assessments in any particular class. It doesn't actually say that every single class has to have 14 quizzes, a performance exam, a midterm, a final, and, you know, a partridge in a pear tree. But I don't see how you really comply with both the spirit and the letter of what the ABA said unless you are giving multiple assessments in most, if not all, of your classes, and if it's multiple, not just two, more than two. Okay. So formative assessments, you probably know what those mean. I've heard it sometimes described as the distinction, what's formative assessment, what's summative assessment? I've sometimes heard the distinction being, well, one's graded and one isn't. I don't think the line is quite that bright. Really, the idea is that both of them are providing feedback, but the summative idea is more that you're supposed to see, okay, now I've tested you all along, now what do you know at, you know, a certain, for lack of a better term, stopping point, you know, a module, a week, a semester, a half a semester. And that the formative idea does have sort of a grading component to it. The idea that it's supposed to be lower stakes and that the feedback that you give to students is more important than any, you know, number or letter that you attach to it. So, then, in case, yes sir?
If I could just add, the way I can best understand it is formative provides feedback at a point when the student can still use it towards meeting the goal, the objectives of that particular class, whereas summative measures and gives you feedback as whether in fact you did learn what you were supposed to learn, but it does not then give you the opportunity to add to what you need to know to do yet better.
I wish I had said it that way. Excellent. So for those of you that didn't already know the perfect distinction between the two of those, please memorize what Ken just said. So, yes, very, very well put. So, as if you needed further convincing, so you've got to use learning outcomes, you've got to use multiple assessments, and not only do you need to assess student performance and see, okay, how is this student doing in a particular course, or how is this particular course doing? 315 also tells you, oh, and by the way, you better be using this data to look at your entire program of legal education. You better be looking at this data to improve your curriculum. Think you're doing it well? Get better. Not doing it very well? Get better. Always use it. Use this data. Okay. So, have you convinced yet that you're supposed to use learning outcomes and multiple assessments? So, if I'm not enough, the ABA at least will tell you, well, hey, who cares what Eric says? We're going to make you do it. So, how are we doing that? Well, from a very high level standpoint, before I turn it over to Jenny, we use in each one of our classes multiple quizzes. These quizzes are often multiple choice. We use a midterm and a final exam. This is just one course we're talking about so far. We also have many courses that incorporate performance-based assessments. You know, legal writing is the natural one, right? So you produce a written product of some kind, a memo, a brief. You know, that's a performance that has to be, you know, assessed in a certain way. We use rubrics to assess them. Jenny will get up and talk more about both of those wonderful things in just a moment. And we also have performance in terms of, for example, our interviewing and counseling class that we had this last year, where you would have students who would come in and have mock interviews with clients. These would be videotaped, and then they would be graded according to their performance on, you know, what they actually did interviewing a client. So all of these things are things that you can assess. All of these things are things that I think count as multiple assessments and are good things, and address a couple of the criticisms. One, don't just have one final exam where that's your entire grade. And two, give us more practical skills. Well, we can do that, and guess what? We can assess it too. So we can give you more practical skills, and we can meet our assessment goals at the same time. So that ends my little period. Now for the important parts. Actually, how you implement this stuff using some of the technology like ExamSoft and Canvas, and I will turn it over to Jennifer. Clicker. Thank you.
So one of our big pieces of software that we use in order to track our students is ExamSoft. I'm sure you've all heard about this software. Many law schools use it because a lot of the bar examiners use this in the bars. However, ExamSoft is more than just a word processor. ExamSoft also has a suite behind it that allows you to enter learning outcomes. Now, we have a lot of different types of learning outcomes. You'll see we have 1L courses, we have the ABA accreditation, standard 3 or 2 in there, we have our 2L courses, our 3L courses, the bar exam. We have a whole group of different learning outcomes that can go in there. I expanded it a little bit.
Jennifer, could you blow it up some?
Possibly.
Control plus, perhaps.
Well, maybe. Unfortunately,
The arrow keys, maybe. There you go. Thank you.
there we go. So this is just civil procedure. Actually, this is just civil procedure 1. So this is 1 semester worth of civil procedure. Our civil procedure class is actually a full year. You'll notice it gets pretty detailed. And you can go even more in depth. We try not to overwhelm our professors too much.
The keyword is too much. Yes.
Too much. Our faculty are actually entering their own questions and tagging their questions with learning outcomes. I know some schools actually do a different model where they have a team entering the questions and tagging the learning outcomes who are not faculty. We have used this model in that we're training the faculty as we go along in ExamSoft. So they are working with their own questions. We still have a few faculty who are not the most comfortable with technology, and we're working with them and working with getting them up and running. We're still working on how we're going to work with our adjuncts. I'm not as comfortable letting our adjuncts in ExamSoft because there's a lot of interesting things they could do. So I think I'm going to be more comfortable entering their questions in and tagging their questions myself rather than having the adjuncts entering questions into ExamSoft. I think they're just going to have greater accounts. But for right now, Eric actually created Eric and Tom, our other civil procedure professor, created over 1,000 civil procedure multiple choice questions and essays and tagged every one of them with learning outcomes. And you can tag more than one learning outcome per question. So this is just an example of the list of questions. You'll see it's pretty extensive. You have a folder system that you can put the questions in. And this is an example question. You will see it's a multiple choice question from the civil procedure exam, and it's actually tagged with 4 learning outcomes. We ask that you tag each question with a minimum of 1 learning outcome. I don't think we actually have a maximum number of learning outcomes you can tag it with, but I think I've only ever seen up to 4. And each question also has a rationale. And we will put our slides up, so don't feel that you have to take pictures. We actually release all of our questions to our students once they finish their exam, so that they can learn from their results. We release all of our quizzes, we release all of the exams, and they can see what they got right, what they got wrong. They see the rationales behind the questions, and there are students who go over every single question, and they are really looking to see what they got right, what they got wrong. I have a student who is already studying for the bar using these materials. He is starting on day 1, and he's just going over and over, and his theory is by the time the bar comes around, now this is a night student, so that's 4 years from now. By the time the bar comes around, he should have seen these questions enough. He should not have to spend a significant portion of his time on civil procedure in his bar class. Yes, ma'am.
So they have to create new questions every year. It's pretty time intensive.
You might need to turn that up.
The short answer, this thing on? Yes, the short answer to that is unfortunately yes. So that is a downside, and we have been talking about that. That's we've been trying to figure out ways to create question banks so that we do have questions that we can use. Then, of course, there's also the way people, professors have traditionally used, or at least in my experience, have used essay exams. They'll wait a certain number of years before they would reuse an exam hypothetical. Long after anyone who would have been around is gone. So there are some solutions we're trying to come up with so that it's not quite as labor intensive as it is. But you're right, it takes a lot of time to write these. I will tell you, because I was trained by the great Beth Donahue, I will tell you it does get easier when you have good training and you figure out how to do this. You do get quicker at it. I'm a heck of a lot quicker at it than I was when I first started writing them. And I think just the learning value of a student, you'll get to see a report in a moment of just how they get to see, you got it wrong, why you got it wrong, and when you see the rationale, when you see a report that goes out to a student, it's just, I just suck it up and say, okay, I'll write new questions.
And as someone, I don't know, I don't want to know if you mind interrupting.
No, please.
Just practical is that, having taught for 25 years, is that sometimes you could just change the names or the order and make slight changes, and so unless the students are pretty sophisticated, they won't realize that it's basically the same question.
I actually tested that. I did not believe it when I started teaching 20 years ago, and I a professor, not only can you do that, but you can actually use the hypothetical in class, go over it, and if you change the names in the product, at least in the first year, it won't matter. And I looked at it, I tested it several times, and unfortunately he was right.
Just an FYI, we give a research competency exam in the legal research and writing class. We actually literally gave them 80% of the questions, and they did not realize it. So they had 80% of the questions in advance, and they did not know that they had 80% of the questions. So I don't know that it truly sinks in with them. Yes, ma'am.
Are you, Eric? Is that?
Yes.
Are you a substantive law professor? What is your role?
Chief cook and bottle washer. I am I teach, this last year I taught civil procedure and legal writing. This next year I'll be teaching evidence and civil procedure. But also one of our philosophies is our doctrinal professors are heavily involved in legal writing, and in fact the inaugural year all of our doctrinal professors, our torts professor taught a section of legal writing, our criminal law professor taught a section of legal writing. I mean, we have had some, we did have some adjuncts involved too, but we're trying to break down some of those walls too, and have doctrinal faculty, heavily involved in legal writing, and not to see those things as different. Yeah.
How did the learning outcomes? You said you were trained. Who did the training?
The lady to my left did a lot of, helped a lot with this, and the lady speaking helped me, figure out how to use ExamSoft.
So I guess.
And some people in this audience as well.
My name is Jenny Wondracek. I am the senior law librarian, but I'm also the Associate Director for Instructional Technology. And I teach legal research. So I'm also a professor. And Beth Donahue, if you'd like to.
Is this on? No.
Tap it. Yeah, tap it. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, I've been working with UNT now for 2.5 years, since before they opened. I was a consultant with them. I was at the NCBE for many years as a program director of the MBE. I was then in K-12 working on online diagnostic assessments for millions of kids, and picked up a lot about learning outcomes and formative assessment there in my role in K-12, and then became a consultant with another former colleague of mine. We've worked with UNT and a few other law schools.
So you created a program to train the faculty on how to do this?
I would not say there's an official program yet. As you'll hear a little bit, I think we've all sort of stumbled into this as a band of brothers and sisters who wanted to do this a little differently. Certainly the dean and associate dean wanted to see a lot of assessment, and as I'll talk about in a few minutes, we did things in a way that I now think we can improve upon, and you'll see some of that work.
I want to offer an unsubstantiated, unscientific idea about this idea of whether you need to wholesale recreate these questions year after year. My argument would be no, you don't. Unlike, you need to rearrange them. You need to change the order of the questions so that people aren't just memorizing A, B, C, D, which they could otherwise do for multiple choice. But in my mind, the main reason a professor puts away the essay question for several years is more so that students don't focus, narrow down their area of study as to only what's going to be covered on the exam. Whereas here, if you have a large number of questions that they're going to face over the course of the semester, they're going to be, even if they talk to previous people who took the class, they're going to know going in, I can't narrow it to one specific topic. And those sentences are all long enough, at least on the screen, to know that to pick the right answer, you've got to both read the question and read through every option before you're going to pick the right one. So I would not be that concerned about it.
There you go, Eric.
Well, thank you.
Again,
Awesome. Yeah.
I have no educational training, as most law faculty don't. So I
think there's also,
that's
there's some security just in sheer numbers too. I mean,
Yeah.
I imagine what would be really wonderful is if we ultimately built up a bank so huge, you know, because there are 10,000 questions, that if your way of studying for the exam is to read every single one of those questions and take that quiz or take that question and answer it and figure out what the right answer is, then you probably deserve to pass anyway, because you've learned an awful lot from taking those 10,000 questions.
Banks like that is a great social enterprise.
Yes.
Indeed, and I would love it if people talk to me after about in some kind of more collaborative way to build these item banks.
I do know that some of our professors actually also used bar questions from the MBE as well, and that helped as well. The students really liked having those questions because they felt that if they could tackle a question that came from the bar, they were on track for where they needed to be. So that was another way that our faculty were making the students feel secure without also cutting down a little bit of time.
Yeah, if you don't use them, the NCBE has online practice exams that are really excellent. They use real questions from the MBE that have been retired, and they also have, for free, small numbers of questions available in their information booklets online that will give you a good idea of what those questions look like. Although, frankly, when you're talking about formative assessment, we found, too, that, you know, bar-type questions aren't always appropriate for formative use because they're really, you know, I mean, that's the ultimate in summative, right? And so a lot of those distractors, the wrong answer choices, will be playing on different ideas, even across courses, but from a different part of the course, that if your students haven't even had that part of the course yet, you know, it would seem like nonsense to them. So when you're introducing students to concepts brand new to them, I think that the kinds of things you ask and the way that you frame your questions is generally different, although I definitely encourage people to use what the NCBE puts out in summative ways.
Are you allowed to use those without copyright permission?
They have deals for whole classes. They're really, really cheap.
Moving on, let's talk about rubrics. Now, ExamSoft has an amazing rubric product. We have been using, all of our permanent faculty have been using rubrics for final exams, but we also use rubrics for more than just exams. For instance, all of our legal research and writing papers, we graded with rubrics. All of our research homework assignments, so the go find this case, what did it say, that kind of, even those easy, like treasure hunt kind of assignments, those were all graded with rubrics. Now, not all of them were graded with ExamSoft rubrics. We did also use Canvas rubrics. But we did use rubrics for many assignments and many types of assignments. Yes, ma'am.
Just a question on your rubrics. I'm assuming that you gave those to the students with the assignments, right?
Not always. It's best practice to give them out ahead of time, but especially for exams, we tend not to give the rubrics out in advance of the final exams. And honestly, sometimes it just wasn't feasible because they weren't written in advance. When you're writing,
We appreciate your honesty.
when you're writing 1,000 questions in 1 year for civil procedure, it's hard to get the rubrics out in advance.
Well, also there's a risk of, I mean, certainly, is this only for multiple choice or is this for essay too?
The rubrics are for essay, for briefs, for memos, for research assignments. We need to get better at getting the rubrics out in advance, but trying to get it so you can see this a little better. This is what the ExamSoft product looks like. And this is one from the final exam essay in Eric's course. You'll see we have the rows where he set up the Rule 20 issue, and then he's got IRAC. Then he's got the SMJ, IRAC, and it goes across. And he's got his columns, approaching mastery, competent, actually I should be looking at my screen, approaching competence, developing, needs development. Now this is setting up the rubric, okay? If I can get it to go forward. Next slide. This is actually what it looks like when you go to grade it. And I did get permission from the student.
Yes.
This is. So here's their essay on this side, and this is the graded essay. So basically you come through and you say, now the ones that have zeros, there's 0 points for. That's just the overall issue. Okay? So this student actually got 3s for everything for the Rule 20 joinder issue. And then 3s all the way down to the SMJ issue. And then the Rule 50 issue, he picked it out, but he really didn't do well on giving the rule or the analysis. It's just this beep, 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 all the way down. You just click the box and move on. You can add comments over here by clicking these little folder icons and type in your comments. But it makes grading really quick and easy.
Oh, wait a second, but this focuses on knowledge.
You want to take that?
Well, I would disagree because if you could see, I mean, you can't see all of the question because the question is much larger than that. But so the question is your typical essay hypothetical. It's, you know, A sees B, and then this happens, and that happens, and somebody crosses the street, and someone hits him, and then this happened, and then you're asked anything from analyze, you know, fully analyze all the issues presented, or all the way down to something very focused. You know, please tell me whether or not the court should grant this motion, or whether or not, you know, you could focus it all the way down to one issue. This, as you could see, is actually several different issues. So they're given just it's just like any other final exam essay. You're given a hypothetical, then the student types out a response that is supposed to do all of the IRAC, you know, supposed to identify the issue, give you the rule that's going to determine the outcome, analyze how that rule applies to the facts of this case, and then come to a conclusion as to, you know, what that rule dictates. And you then use the rubric to evaluate how well they did that. Did they do a good job of identifying the issue? Did they do a good job of telling you the rule? How good was their analysis? I mean, to me, there is, sure, is there some knowledge being tested there? Yeah, you can just memorize the rule and spit it back at me and you'll get some points. Here's the part, can you scroll back over? Here's the part, and the other way, all the way to the far right. Here's the point that she hadn't gotten to yet that I wanted to mention out. I guess it doesn't go far enough. ExamSoft allows you to weight each one of these dimensions differently. So for example, just identifying the rule or just identifying the issue or spitting the rule back to me is worth this much. Your analysis is worth this much. So I really do think it tests application and it allows me to evaluate how well you actually apply that stuff.
What about synthesis between issues or writing skills and clarity? Do you subsume those into your, did they state the issue or do you do them separately?
You build, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That, I think,
It takes a second.
sorry. That is all built into how the professors define those numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. Right, so for each rule and each analysis, you can go back and see how he's defined, you know, I'm sure clarity is probably in there, synthesis is probably in there, or some version of that.
Well, I'll even give you a kind of an alternative response. Not only could you evaluate them and, you know, have the description based on, you know, did you use synthesis and did you synthesize this rule from both Rule 15 and, you know, the 3 cases that we talked about in class. I could evaluate you on that within the description inside, you know, one of these cells in the rubric box. I could also just have a separate, and legal writing is one of them, where I think this was a good example, where if I do want to evaluate just the clarity with which you delivered your information, I can make that an entire different dimension. I can just have one of the things on which I grade you. What's your, for this whole paper, what was your grammar like? What was your style like? How about clarity? I mean, you can make the rubric however you want to. You can build that as its own row, as its own column, or even in the description of the rubric. And that's really only kind of limited by your creativity.
And hopefully all of those dimensions tie back then to a learning outcome as well.
And that's what this little button, categories, is for. Those categories, you click that button, categories, and you get to link whatever your assessment is. So here, this essay exam, each one of those things, each one of those category buttons can be a different learning outcome. Now, that whole issue is probably 1 or 2 learning outcomes, but you can tag the essay to learning outcomes as well, so that you also get the data to figure out how's that working.
Good question in the back.
You taught classes without learning outcomes and rubrics.
The short answer is yes, because I taught as a visitor once, but yeah, so.
So how much longer did it take you to prepare those exams versus this one? I'm trying to tell my to buy into this, what's it going to take? How's it going to be different?
It's, I will tell you the hardest part for me was the learning curve to learn how to draft good, valid, reliable multiple choice questions. That part for me was the most time consuming. The essay exam, once somebody else, puts in all of these learning outcomes, and writing the essay exam and then tagging the learning outcomes was super easy. I mean, that takes virtually no time. And really, the rubric is not that much different than what I've seen every other professor that I've had experience with. They had like a point sheet, or they had some little way of kind of ticking, oh, there's 100 possible points, and I see you said you said the magic word here, so I give you a point, and you said this magic word, so I mean, the rubrics are just a better, more refined kind of version of that, so I don't think there's a lot of additional work there. For me, the hardest part, and what I could envision the hardest sell being, is trying to get someone to learn how to write a multiple choice question reliably and validly. But then once you do, as we've already talked about, there are ways that you can reuse those questions. So maybe the work is on the front end, and then the other way you sell it to them is, hey, you know what the easiest question to grade in the world is? And so I had at least a couple of hands. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk about how you used those 1,000 multiple choice questions that you created? Was it the quizzes? Was it the midterm? Was it the final? Was it all of them? Was it learning?
All of the above. Used in civil procedure, I'll just give you civil procedure as an example. All of my quizzes were all multiple choice. My midterm was half multiple choice and half essay. My final was half multiple choice and half essay.
And so the multiple choice on your final those weren't repeats of earlier multiple choice, those were new ones?
No, I came up with new questions because, I've been at a different point in the course, so, by the time I get to a final exam, I really can test synthesis. I really can see if you can tell, how the joinder rules work with the subject matter jurisdiction rules, and, how these all intertwine. But when I'm just teaching you, subject matter jurisdiction and I'm not to joinder yet, I can only test you on what I've actually taught. So yeah, they were different by the time we got to the end.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the permanent faculty had decided that the essays could not be more than 50%, or maybe it was even 45%. They could not be more than 50% of the final.
I don't know that we came up with a hard and fast rule about that, but there was this kind of general agreement that it needs to be something more than just, just an essay. Don't throw in 5 multiple choice questions that are worth, 5% of the grade and then the other 95%. I mean, the idea is for it to have a significant component of both, because they both are really good at testing different things and are better at some things than other, which, Beth knows a whole lot more about than than I do, but there's value in both of them. And wouldn't it be great if the first time all of your graduates saw a 200 question multiple choice exam, wouldn't it be great if the first time they saw a multiple choice question was not that day? So we're trying to get as many as we can.
I was just going to jump in real quick and say someone before mentioned releasing rubrics to students. This is what you'd release here, basically telling the student what you're looking for when you expect them to analyze an issue or state a rule. Obviously, the grading sheet that we saw actually included the specific issues that were on the exam. You wouldn't generally release that to the students.
I'm worried about derailing what I think is an extraordinary conversation, and by the way, muzzles off on what I think is just an incredibly sophisticated process for this. To me, the challenge of the APA standard has always been not course level, which I think we at least generally intuit if we don't all do well, but then when you move that into program level, how are we assessing the success of the first year curriculum and or the success of the business certificate, and then ultimately, of course, the JD curriculum in general. Does this feed into program level assessment?
It does.
Okay, so that's an extraordinary question, actually. We started out with course level learning outcomes plus program level learning outcomes and mapped the two. We are now, I believe, thinking we're going to have I think we're very close to, because what we found is at least for certainly across the doctrinal courses in the 1L year, although a lot of the language used in the course level learning outcomes was specific to that course, a lot of the cognitive skills that they were getting at were very, very, very similar. They all had some aspect of, know some basic law, be able to analyze and synthesize and be able to apply the law to new, those kinds of just basic skills. So I've got a set now of learning outcomes that I actually built for Barbary and love to show them to anybody. I didn't bring more than one copy, but if you follow up with me, I can get you a copy. Barbary is very interested in formative assessment, and we're working now with a faculty at UNT to, not Barbary, I'm sorry, I wear several hats here, but we're working on a similar process of how can we have a single set. My mic keeps cutting out, I think. Hello, okay. How do we make a single set of outcomes for the skills and abilities that students need throughout 3 years of law school, that every single professor basically just circles one of the, these are the 3 things that I teach in my course when it comes to skill and ability. And then the only thing the professor does on his or her own is the list of content. This is the content that I cover. It's your basic syllabus outline. And I think that will make our lives much, much easier, because as you see with all of what Eric has done in his course, so many of those outcomes have been tested by him, but very, very, very similar skills have been tested by other professors, but because their outcomes were slightly different, it was very hard for us to then say, okay, so how are students analyzing? How are students applying? And if we have a single set of outcomes, then we can make decisions about who is struggling much, much, much sooner in the course of the semester. We can, because they're using a lot of this, they might be testing application in a different content area, so we can tell you're struggling in contracts but not in torts. But if a student is struggling across the board, we can zero in on some of the areas where they're having trouble. Do they just not know it? Are they not keeping up with the knowledge? Are they having problems only when it gets to the application? Or are they having problems only when they get to an ability like writing, where we see that they know the basic doctrine and can apply it, but they're unable to organize and create their own argument from scratch. So we're trying to figure out ways that we can make this much easier for the faculty, first of all, and then secondly, how we can intervene much sooner with students based on some more basic set of skills and abilities that are shared across all faculty.
And to do your, and to do the, and to do the last part, which ties really well into 315, right, which is as a program, how are we doing as a program? So what do we need to fix, and how can we get better? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering about the outcomes, and I'm wondering, when you create them, do you map them against your local bar exam, for example? Or do you look at the surveys that have been done for the practicing lawyers? Do you can comment about that?
So so when we created these learning outcomes, and actually a lot of these outcomes were created before I was even here, but I got to look at them and tweak them and, review them and, put my own touch on them. But the short answer is yes. We looked very heavily at the bar and what the bar is going to test you over. We really have, everything I do kind of has two goals. One, get you ready to pass the bar. If you can't pass the bar, who cares about anything else? Number two, be a competent entry-level, first-year lawyer. I'm not measuring you against, the 20-year veteran who's a probate, expert. I want you competent entry-level lawyer. So you need to be able to do both of those. So when we identified learning outcomes, we sat and thought, these are the two goals we have to get to. Let's engineer from that backwards. So if it's, you got to pass the bar, we got to look what's tested on the bar. And if it's, what are the skills necessary to be a competent entry-level attorney, like being able to interview a client or being able to, make an argument in court, we work learning outcomes backwards from those goals.
I'd just add that those are actually sort of tracked separately. So each question is tagged to the professor's learning outcomes, and there we started with, what do you want your students to know and be able to do? And we didn't necessarily say, look at what the bar tests and then build your learning outcomes on that. It so happens, I think, that there is significant overlap, certainly in the first year, between what professors want their students to know and what's on the bar. But in ExamSoft, those are a separate set of tags, so we can look at, the skills and abilities, we can look at content, we can also look at bar exam content separately.
One more quick question. Do you grade on a curve?
No.
No, the short answer is no. We all had a meeting, and that was the shortest faculty meeting I think we've ever had. We all sat around and said, no, it's pedagogically indefensible, it's a bad idea, so let's just not do it. So, I don't know, I guess when I can say no, I should just say no. No, and shut up. No, there was at least another, yes ma'am.
Your outcome was to be an entry-level competent attorney. Mm-hmm. Did you have any engagement with the lawyer community to what that is?
Oh, gosh.
Because once they pass the bar and they practice, the expectations of the community are certainly not necessarily always aligned with law school.
Sure.
So did you have input when you were developing these with the local bar or with practitioners or employers?
God, yeah, I know there's...
This is one of those, I wish we had. We did not have time. But if you see in the original, can you go back to the original ExamSoft screen that had all of the learning outcomes for, 1L courses, 2L courses, 3L courses. You'll see faculty and review groups there. One of our initial goals that we unfortunately did not have time to ever get to was to circulate a lot of questions with not only other faculty, but with practitioners in Dallas to see and ask them, do you think this is stuff that you would expect a new associate to be able to do? Is this important, or is this sort of too off in the weeds? So we had initially thought that we would try to get more practicing attorney input in this whole program, and we have not yet, but we will, I hope.
Yes, sir.
Just to follow up on that and to kind of circle back on something you had said earlier, when we create our learning outcomes, we did have a survey of local lawyers, alumni, and judges, kind of what skills they want to see. So that did influence that, and that might be an option that you can look at when you do it at your school. But when you talk about creating outcomes and writing good multiple choice questions, back in the session this morning, I mentioned Carnegie Mellon has a fantastic resource on how to write multiple choice questions, how to write assessments, how to write learning outcomes, step-by-step guide. So if you're looking for a resource and your school of law doesn't have one currently, I would start there. And and obviously email you guys.
Well, I think one of the biggest, I guess, overall lessons that we can impart, which you also touched on this morning, is this stuff really takes a lot of time. And so I think most law schools, to do it well, really do need some staff to support it.
Yeah.
I will say, once you do put the time in, ExamSoft especially will give you a lot of great analytics. This is just an example of some of the reports on the professor side. Now, this is not the longitudinal reports, which you can also get, but these are ones that once you have an assessment up, every professor can see. So they can go through and they can get all of these. I also pulled a copy of one of the reports for one of Eric's quizzes. So this is one of our students who did very well in this quiz, actually. And you can see he's getting a report on the learning outcomes and how he did in comparison to the other exam takers. And it goes through, tells him his score, tells him how he did in comparison. It goes through all of the different categories, which are the learning outcomes. It goes through all of the different questions, tells him the right answers, tells him what he answered, and it tells him the rationale for each question. And he gets this for every assessment that he takes. So this is a quiz. He also gets one for the midterm and the final exam. So he can go through and he can use the quizzes to study for the midterm. He can use the quizzes in the midterm to study for the final. He can come back, he can use all of these to study for the bar. Our students get a lot of feedback. They always know how they are doing in a course. They should never be surprised by the grade they get in the end.
Do you have a curve?
No, we do not have a curve.
So why do you compare them?
We actually don't. I just pulled the statistics. Sometimes they want the statistics. They want to see how they're doing. But usually, the very first exams, we actually gave them their statistics because they are competitive. They are law students.
Yeah, I hate to interrupt you, but I don't do that.
We don't in the end.
I don't give them, means, medians, average. I don't give them any of that information. I don't want to fuel they're competitive enough. I don't want to fuel any of that and want them knowing, oh, I'm first and I'm second or I'm whatever. I mean, grades are bad enough, but we got to give grades. So, that is plenty to fuel competition.
Right. I just put it in so you could see the kinds of information you can get, but in reality, we don't give them the average. We did the first time we released the report. After that, we said no because we saw their competitive nature. Like, no, calm down. So we don't. We just give them their grades. Sometimes they get feisty. They want to know, well, how did the other people do? No, you don't need that information. So we do also use Canvas. I'm really not going to talk about that. We do use some other technologies to help the students along. We are not using Clio in its traditional capacity. We are using Clio because our students track their time from the day they enter the doors. So they are tracking their time on what they study, on their class time, all that good stuff. We are trying to train them to be lawyers, and lawyers bill time. iClickers, traditional use. Vimeo, we do interviewing and counseling. We record all of those videos. and they're doing peer reviews and things like that on their view.
That time tracking, does that feed into an e-portfolio or something that is part of your program assessment?
We are working on getting portfolios set up in Canvas because Canvas has that ability. The judges, actually, that our students are doing externships with, really like the fact that they've already started billing as 1Ls, because that's something that the upper level students that they see aren't used to doing unless they're in clinics. So the other thing that they're doing is they're summarizing their classes in the sections of Clio that usually are reserved for the description of billing time. So that's helping them reflect on what they're learning. So it's a different way to use Clio, but it's one of our professors'
Does
idea.
someone actually look at the time they bill?
Yes, Professor Watley is one of our professors, and she looks at every single person's Clio report.
And is there some feedback about my experiences, particularly with 1L students, what they'll bill as an hour is not actually an hour of billable time?
She actually makes them turn in weekly reports through their criminal law class. So they are getting feedback, and they aren't always happy with their feedback. But that is part of being a lawyer, and yes, they need to learn it. So.
I know you're a newer school, and you've been doing this for a short period of time. Do you have any data on the amount of students who don't make it, flunk out, if at all, and who pass the bar?
We have no one who's taken the bar because we only have 1Ls. We started off with 155. Last time I checked, we had 142. Most of them have withdrawn because we don't have federal financial aid. So.
No data.
Yes. We will have federal financial aid as of September. So, yay us. I'm out of time. Yes, but we only have 5 minutes.
So yeah, so the most important part is
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'll go really quick. I got into this mostly just talking to people about how to write multiple choice questions in the legal field. And this is my high-level checklist for writing a test question. Every test question, and whether it's multiple choice or something else, some other format, every test question should test something important in a straightforward manner and at the appropriate time. Why is this important here? Because in writing questions, I found that how do you know if a question is testing something important? That's where your learning outcomes come in. Ideally, what you're asking is tied directly to something that you've already said you want your students to know or to be able to do. And often it can be tied so closely that the language is even mirrored as the highlighted language is here. This is a learning outcome that I think it's from a contracts course, yes. This was a contracts course learning outcome. And I always say that has to be an important outcome, and then the prompt has to be linked to the outcome. Well, here's what we found in the last several years of not just working with UNT, but in working with a lot of law professors in building assessment programs either just within their course or across courses in a law school. There are a lot of different crossroads that you come to when you start thinking about building an assessment program. And I boil it down to, and I'll show you a bigger map here because this starts expanding very rapidly. It boils down to, I think, a sort of a tension between academic freedom and flexibility for professors to work directly with students, to know exactly what their students are seeing and when their students are seeing it, and to engage with their students and teach what they want to teach on the one hand, and on the other hand, having scores that are comparable across courses, across professors, across schools even, potentially someday. And then having common remediation. One of the problems we have in law school is if you're teaching to 100 students, it's not maybe practical for you to be the #1 person remediating when students are struggling. So what some law schools are now looking at is, instead of having course-specific learning outcomes, how can we build cross-course learning outcomes at the skill and ability level, which I already touched on. Testing something in a straightforward manner starts touching on drafting guidelines or editorial rules about how you write your questions, right? And if left on their own, every professor is going to have a lot of little quirks about what they like to test, how they like to write. And again, you're going to have some tension there if every professor is writing differently. Are you ultimately comparing apples to oranges when you're looking at, are my students able to apply the law? Well, two different professors are testing the same thing, but maybe they're testing it in such a radically different way just because of the style of their questions. So again, you have a choice to make as a school. Do we have draft or specific guidelines, let each professor do their own style of writing questions? Or do we have common guidelines? And I think that goes for, that's not specific to multiple choice again. And then what does it mean to be at the appropriate time? Again, do you have the instructor controlling and building tests and controlling when that test is put in front of their students? Or is there some kind of common test building and administration entity, someone in the school, or God forbid, someone outside the school? What I saw a lot of in K-12 was for-profit test vendors that put together tests, often as a kind of a preparatory test for a more high-stakes exam. But then when formative assessment got very big and diagnostic assessment got very big in K through 12, those vendors would start carving up those same tests into little smaller units and selling basically the same questions, and administering the tests and then reporting back to them on schools, and all sort of completely ignoring the faculty or the instructors in those schools and what they were actually doing in the classroom. So what I would say, at least from just, and I'm just one person, but what I have learned, I think, is that this last path is wrong, that this is not formative assessment. If you're looking for building feedback loops to promote learning and retention, do not follow this path. You need, at the very least, that very last step should be instructor controlled. That instructors should see what questions are going in front of their students when. It doesn't necessarily mean that the instructors are writing the questions themselves, but they see what's going in front of their students and they can replace questions they don't like, for instance. This is something that Barbary would like to develop, something using a lot of the questions that they've developed over the years, but allow professors to have some control over swapping in and out questions. But even if your professors are writing their own questions, agreeing to some kind of basic editorial style guidelines will likely lead to data that's a little bit easier for you to analyze across courses. I'm sorry, I really rushed through that because I know we're out of time, but